The quiet panic. You guys have been asking me to cover this topic for months now, and honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to tell this story. But after everything that's happened, I think it's time you heard about the most terrifying discovery I've ever made. This isn't just some random creepy tale. This is something that completely changed how I see the world around me. It started 3 weeks ago when I moved into my grandmother's old house. She'd passed away 6 months earlier, and the family finally decided someone should live there instead of letting it sit empty. I volunteered because, let's be honest, free rent in this economy, I wasn't about to pass that up. Plus, I had fond memories of visiting her as a kid during summer vacations. The house sits on the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides. It's one of those classic 2-story homes from the 1940s with white siding and green shutters. Nothing fancy, but it had character. What I didn't expect was how different it would feel living there alone compared to those childhood visits filled with family and laughter. The first week went smoothly enough. I spent most of my time unpacking boxes and getting familiar with the layout again. The house had been mostly untouched since my grandmother's death, so there were still her belongings everywhere. Photo albums, old books, vintage furniture covered in floral patterns. It felt like stepping back in time, which was both comforting and slightly unsettling. But here's where things get interesting. On my 8th night there, I was lying in bed around midnight when I noticed something strange. There was a faint light coming from somewhere above me. At first, I thought maybe I'd left a light on upstairs, but I distinctly remembered turning everything off before bed. I'm pretty obsessive about that kind of thing. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and crept upstairs to investigate. All the rooms were dark, just as I'd left them. But as I stood in the hallway, I could still see that soft glow. It seemed to be coming from directly overhead. That's when I realized something I'd somehow missed during my entire week of living there. There was an attic access panel in the ceiling. Now, I'd been in my grandmother's attic plenty of times as a kid. She used to store Christmas decorations up there, and sometimes I'd help her carry boxes down. But for some reason, I'd completely forgotten about it. Maybe it was because the access panel was painted over and blended into the ceiling so well. I pulled down the folding ladder and climbed up, expecting to find maybe an old lamp that had been left on for months. What I found instead was something that made absolutely no sense. The attic was completely empty except for one thing: a single window at the far end, and it was glowing with this warm, inviting light. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. That window was facing the woods behind the house. There shouldn't have been any light source out there. No street lights, no neighboring houses, nothing. Just dense forest for miles. Yet somehow this soft yellow glow was streaming through that window like sunlight. I walked closer, my footsteps creaking on the old wooden boards. The light wasn't harsh or artificial looking. It reminded me of candlelight, or maybe the warm glow of a fireplace. As I approached the window, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something about this whole situation felt fundamentally wrong. When I finally reached the window and looked out, what I saw defied every logical explanation I could think of. There, about 50 yards into the woods, was what appeared to be a small cottage. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. Stone walls, a thatched roof, and warm light pouring from its windows. Smoke was even rising from a chimney. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring. This made no sense. I'd walked those woods countless times as a child. I knew every trail, every clearing. There had never been any structure back there, let alone something that looked like it belonged in medieval Europe. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But when I looked again, the cottage was still there. In fact, I could now make out more details. There were flower boxes under the windows, a small garden to one side, and what looked like a stone pathway leading up to the front door. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be real. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion, or perhaps someone had built something back there recently and I just hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. I decided to get a better look. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see if there were any signs of life around the cottage. That's when I saw movement in one of the windows. A shadow passed by, followed by another. Someone was definitely inside. My first instinct was to grab a flashlight and go investigate immediately. But something held me back. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was some primal instinct warning me to stay away. Whatever it was, I decided to wait until morning. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to get the image of that cottage out of my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that warm, inviting glow. Part of me wondered if I dreamed the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. It was too vivid, too real. The next morning, I woke up early and immediately climbed back up to the attic. Sunlight was now streaming through the window, and I eagerly looked out toward the woods, expecting to see the cottage in daylight. But there was nothing there. Just trees, undergrowth, and shadows. No cottage, no pathway, no garden. Nothing. I spent the next hour searching every inch of those woods, following paths I remembered from childhood and even creating new ones. I found nothing that even remotely resembled what I'd seen the night before. It was as if the cottage had simply vanished with the sunrise. That night, I returned to the attic window. And sure enough, as soon as darkness fell, the cottage reappeared. Same warm glow, same stone walls, same wisps of smoke rising from the chimney. It was exactly as I'd seen it before, down to the smallest detail. Over the next several nights, I established a routine. Every evening after sunset, I'd climb up to the attic and watch the cottage. I started taking notes, trying to document everything I observed. The lights would always come on just as the sun disappeared completely. I'd see those same shadows moving around inside. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of what looked like furniture. A rocking chair, a dining table, shelves lined with books. But here's what really started to unnerve me. On the fourth night of watching, I saw something that made my hands shake. There was a figure standing in the cottage's front doorway. It was too dark and too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely human-shaped, and it seemed to be looking directly at me. The figure stood there for maybe 10 minutes, completely motionless. Then slowly it raised what appeared to be an arm and waved. Not a friendly wave, but a deliberate, purposeful gesture that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart racing. This wasn't just some unexplained phenomenon anymore. Whatever was in that cottage knew I was watching. And somehow, that changed everything. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that figure waving at me from the cottage doorway. The gesture kept replaying in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the more sinister it seemed. This wasn't some random hallucination or trick of light anymore. Something was actively acknowledging my presence. The next few days, I tried to convince myself to stay away from the attic. I threw myself into unpacking, organizing my grandmother's belongings, anything to keep my mind occupied. But as soon as evening approached, I felt this overwhelming pull to climb those stairs and look out that window. It was like an addiction I couldn't shake. On the 7th night of watching, something changed. As I peered through the glass, I noticed the cottage looked different somehow. The warm glow seemed brighter, more inviting, and there were more lights on inside than usual. But what really caught my attention was the front door. It was standing wide open. I could see directly into what appeared to be the main room. There was a fireplace with flames dancing inside, comfortable-looking chairs arranged in a circle, and shelves lined with old books. It looked incredibly cozy, like the kind of place you'd want to spend a cold winter evening. But there was no one visible inside. That's when I heard it, faint but unmistakable, music drifting through the night air. It sounded like a melody from another era, something you might hear in an old music box. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, and despite every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I found myself opening the attic window. The music became clearer once the window was open. It was definitely coming from the cottage, and now I could hear other sounds too. The crackling of the fire, what sounded like pages turning, and occasionally very soft footsteps moving around inside. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next, but I called out. Just a simple hello into the darkness. My voice seemed to carry much further than it should have, echoing through the woods until it reached the cottage. The music stopped immediately. The footsteps ceased. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to quiet down. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, from somewhere inside the cottage, I heard a voice call back. It was impossible to make out the words, but it sounded like an invitation. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to that cottage. I grabbed the strongest flashlight I could find and headed outside. The night air was crisp and still, with no wind rustling the leaves. As I approached the tree line, I could see the cottage's glow filtering through the branches ahead. My flashlight beam seemed weak and pathetic compared to that warm, golden light. The walk through the woods felt longer than it should have. Trees I'd known since childhood seemed taller and more menacing in the darkness. Branches caught at my clothes, and more than once I stumbled over roots I couldn't see despite my flashlight. But I pressed on, following that beckoning glow. When I finally emerged into the small clearing where the cottage sat, I stopped dead in my tracks. Up close, it was even more remarkable than I'd imagined. The stone walls were covered in climbing ivy, and the windows glowed like warm amber. The flower boxes were filled with blooms I'd never seen before, and they seemed to shimmer in the light. The front door was still open, and I could see inside clearly now. The furniture looked antique but well-maintained. There were books scattered on a small table, a tea set laid out for two, and that fire crackling merrily in the stone fireplace. But still no sign of whoever lived here. I approached the doorway cautiously, calling out again. "Hello? Is anyone home?" My voice echoed strangely in the space, as if the cottage were much larger inside than it appeared from outside. That's when she appeared. An elderly woman emerged from what must have been a back room. She was small and frail-looking, with long white hair braided down her back and wearing a dress that looked like it belonged to another century. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when she looked at me, it felt like she could see right through to my soul. "I wondered when you'd finally come down," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "You've been watching for quite some time." I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what was happening. This woman, this cottage, none of it should exist. Yet here I was, having a conversation with someone who clearly lived in a place that vanished with the sunrise. "Please come in," she continued, gesturing toward one of the chairs by the fire. "I've been expecting you." Against every rational thought in my head, I stepped inside. The cottage felt warm and welcoming, filled with the scent of herbs and old books. As I settled into the chair she'd indicated, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a collection of photographs, and in every single one of them I could see my grandmother's house in the background. "You recognize them," the woman said, noticing my stare. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The photographs showed the cottage at different times of year, sometimes in snow, sometimes surrounded by spring flowers. But in each one, my grandmother's house was visible through the trees, looking exactly as it did now. "How long have you been here?" I finally managed to ask. She smiled, and for a moment her whole face seemed to light up. "Time works differently here, child. I've been waiting for someone from that house to find me for, well, let's just say it's been a very long time." "Waiting for someone? Why?" "Because," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "I have something that belongs to your family. Something your grandmother asked me to keep safe until the right person came along." She stood up and walked to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. From inside, she pulled out a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and I could see my grandmother's initials embossed on the front. "She used to visit me, you know," the woman continued. "Not often, but when she needed guidance or just someone to talk to. She was one of the few people who could see this place." I took the journal with trembling hands. As I opened it, I recognized my grandmother's handwriting immediately. The entries were dated, starting from when she was just a young woman. Page after page detailed her visits to this cottage, conversations with this mysterious woman, and guidance she'd received during difficult times in her life. "Who are you?" I whispered. "I'm someone who exists between worlds," she replied simply. "A guardian of sorts for those who need sanctuary or wisdom. Your grandmother found me during the darkest period of her life, and I helped her find her way. She knew that one day someone else from her family would need the same guidance." As I read through the journal, I realized that my grandmother had been preparing for this moment. Her final entries spoke of sensing that her time was ending. and her hope that I would be the one to find this place. She'd written about my struggles, my uncertainty about my future, and her belief that this woman could help me the same way she'd once been helped. The cottage only appears to those who truly need sanctuary, the woman explained. You've been lost, haven't you? Uncertain about your path, feeling disconnected from the world around you? I nodded, tears forming in my eyes. She was right. Moving into my grandmother's house hadn't just been about free rent. I'd been drifting through life, unsure of my purpose, feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. We talked through the night, this mysterious guardian and I. She shared wisdom that seemed to come from centuries of experience, helping me understand things about myself that I'd never been able to articulate. As dawn approached, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace and direction. Will I see you again? I asked as the first hints of sunlight began filtering through the windows. When you need guidance, you'll know where to find me, she said with that same warm smile. But remember, the cottage only appears to those who truly need sanctuary. Don't come looking unless your heart is genuinely seeking answers. I made my way back through the woods as the sun rose, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. When I reached the attic window and looked back, the cottage was gone, just as I'd expected. But this time I wasn't disturbed by its disappearance. I understood now that some things exist beyond our normal perception of reality. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've read through my grandmother's journal countless times, learning about a side of her life I never knew existed. I've also found my own sense of purpose, guided by the wisdom that mysterious woman shared with me. I still climb up to the attic some nights and look out that window. The cottage hasn't appeared again, and I haven't tried to call out to it. I know it will be there when I truly need it, and for now, that knowledge is enough. So there you have it, the story of the light in the attic window. I know some of you won't believe it, and honestly, I can't blame you. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I would have thought they were crazy too. But sometimes the most important truths are the ones that can't be explained by logic alone. If you're going through a difficult time right now, feeling lost or uncertain about your path, maybe keep your eyes open for your own version of that cottage. Sometimes the guidance we need most comes from the most unexpected places. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next one.